Dzień dobry Państwu, witam niezwykle serdecznie tego popołudnia, trzeciego dnia Europejskiego Forum Nowych Idei, podczas ostatniego wykładu w serii wykładów towarzyszących Europejskiemu Forum Nowych Idei. Przed nami wystąpi dr Benjamin Barber, konsultant wielu światowych liderów politycznych, założyciel i prezydent organizacji Safe World, promującej m.in. demokrację i edukację obywatelską. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Benjamin Barber.
Thank you very much for being here and not next door with Mikhail Gorbachev. Although I have to say, although I know him and I admire everything he did in the 1980s and the 1990s, he represents the past, and today we're going to talk about the future. Because the basic thesis, the basic argument I want to make today is that the nation state, 400 years old, is part of the past, and the city is our destiny, the city is our future. And I'm going to explain why I think that is so and the difference it will make for our global politics today. Let me also say I started yesterday at the panel on innovation. Is innovation at an end? Well, that's a silly question. Of course, technological innovation goes on, but I think what many of us agreed at the panel was that while technological and science innovation continues, social innovation is at a standstill. And political and social innovation is what we desperately need today, not technological innovation. So in a way, this paper and my current work is about civic and social innovation. What I want to do is change the subject. The subject we are talking about, the subject next door, the subject in many of our panels here and around the world is nation states. Poland, America, France, Germany, China, Brazil, or Europe, or the United Nations. I want to suggest that we need to change the subject from nation states to cities. And when we do that, we find there are answers to many of the crucial questions that we are asking today. Particularly, there are answers to the fundamental problem of today, which I believe is the problem of democratic crisis. Not fiscal crisis, not economic crisis, but the crisis in democracy. In fact, in this teeming world of too much difference and too little community and too little solidarity, democracy is and has been for a while in deep crisis. The nation states that once rescued democracy from the problem of scale, a growing world, is now preventing democracy from dealing with globalization. The question I want to ask is, if we change the subject, is it possible that, and I'll be a little bit rhetorical here, is it possible that the city can save the world and at the same time can save democracy? To answer that question, we come full circle in the history of our civilization. Human beings began the march to politics, to civilization, and to democracy in the ancient polis, the ancient town. It was democracy's original incubator. But for thousands of years now, driven by scale, the growing population of the world, the growing size of territories, the township, the polis, no longer seemed adequate to the task of politics. And instead, in the 15th and 16th century, in the West, we invented a new idea, the idea of the nation state, the nation as an invented people. There were no Poles or French or Germans in the ancient world. The very idea of the nation, of ein Volk, un peuple, a gens, is an invented notion around which we organize territorial large nation states. And for 400 or 500 years, the nation state carried the burden of the social contract, the burden of our politics, and the burden of democracy. Democracy, which was born in the city, born in the polis, became a ward of the nation state. It grew, it developed, the franchise was extended in the nation state. But today, after 400 years of considerable success, the nation state is failing us in our attempts to deal with globalization, with politics, economics, and crisis on a global scale. The nation state was the perfect recipe for liberty and for the independence of autonomous peoples and nations. But the nation state is utterly unsuited to the new world of interdependence in which we live. The city, on the other hand, which was always the human habitat of first resort, the place where we first came together into communities, has in this globalizing world once again become democracy's best hope, the place we can seek democracy and look for ways to globalize democracy. Now, urbanity, our urban nature, some people say it's natural, some say it's not, but quite clearly, by design or not, it does today define how we live, how we work, how we play, how we associate. Whatever large-scale political arrangements are fashionable, politics still begins in the neighborhood, in the town. We say everywhere, all politics is local, by which we mean it starts where we live, in our neighborhood, in our community, in our towns, and in our cities. In fact, more, and this just happened last year, more than half the world's population now live in cities. And in the developed world, it's almost 80% of the world's people live in cities. So as it was once our origin, cities today increasingly appear to be our destiny as well. And so if democracy is to be rescued from the crisis of the nation state, the crisis of sovereignty, the crisis of globalization, it appears that the city rather than the nation state may be the agent of change. The biggest political challenge we face today is how to establish alternative institutions to the state, given that the state is not working. Institutions that are capable of addressing the multiplying problems of an interdependent world, and yet without surrendering democracy, which has been tied up in the box of the nation state for the last 400 years. If we are to save ourselves both from the anarchic forms of globalization, war and terrorism, and the monopolistic forms of globalization, which are corporation and bank-centered, we need global democratic bodies that work. In the centuries of conflict that have defined the world, from the Congress of Vienna to the defeat of the Axis powers and the writing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, from the Treaty of Versailles to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and to the end of a bipolar world, thanks to our friend Mikhail Gorbachev and others, nation states during all that time have made almost no progress towards global governance. On the contrary. Yet democracy remains locked up in the embrace of the nation state, and there seems little chance either to democratize globalization or to globalize democracy if we rely on nation states to do so. Now, I believe the solution is in front of us, obvious but largely unnoticed. Let cities, the most networked and interconnected of all our political associations, defined above all by pragmatism and by cooperation, by creativity, and by multiculturalism, let them do what states cannot. In a phrase, let mayors rule the world. Since, as Edward Glaser, the American urbanist, has written, and I quote, "The strength that comes from human collaboration is the central truth behind civilization's success and the primary reason why cities exist. Then surely, if he is right, cities can and should govern globally." In fact, and this is the most important thing I will say today, in fact, that is already happening. Cities are already networked into webs of culture, commerce, and communication. These networks and the cooperative complexes they embody can be helped to do formally what they are already doing informally, governed through voluntary cooperation, best practices, and shared consensus. If mayors were to actually rule the world, the 3.5+ billion people, more than half the world's population, who live in cities, and the many more who live near and next to and in the region of cities, could both participate locally in politics and help cooperate to govern globally at the same time. And I would argue that this form of politics, this form of cooperation, promises pragmatism instead of politics, innovation rather than ideology, and solutions in place of sovereignty. The challenge of democracy in the modern world has been how to join participation, which is local, with power, which is central. The nation state once did the job, but recently it's become too large to allow meaningful participation, even as it remains too small to address central or global power. That's been the problem of Europe. The nation state, too large for participation, too small to actually govern effectively economic power. Cosmopolitanism, on the other hand, responds by imagining citizens who are rooted in urban neighborhoods where participation and community are still possible, at the same time reaching across frontiers to confront and contain central, even global power. Imagines them joining together to oversee and regulate anarchic globalization and the illegitimate market forces that globalization has unleashed. A world governed by cities does not require that a new governing global edifice be invented, be artificially constructed. And it does not mean that networked cities must be certified by nation states. It places the emphasis on bottom-up citizenship, on civil society, on voluntary community across borders, rather than on top-down prescriptions and executive mandates that emanate from unitary global rulers. It is, in other words, what I once called a strong democratic, a participatory form of politics. New York's Mayor Bloomberg said recently, playing on the resonance of municipal localism played out in an interdependent world, he said, "I have my own army in the NYPD, the New York Police Force. I have my own State Department," much to the annoyance of Foggy Bottom, the State Department in Washington. New York has every kind of people from every part of the world and every kind of problem. And if Washington doesn't like it, he said, well, I don't listen to Washington very much. It's not boasting, but both the burdens and the possibilities of the city that give Mayor Bloomberg's claim their power and force. For as he insists, and I quote the mayor, "The difference between my level of government and other levels of government is that action takes place at the city level." And then he goes on to say, while American government right now is incapable of doing anything, the mayors of this country still have to deal with the real world. And that's a fact throughout the world. When politics is blocked in Rome or Madrid or Athens or Warsaw, cities and city mayors and city citizens still have to do the everyday work of governance. By expanding then and diversifying the networks through which cities are already cooperating, cities are proving that they in fact can do and are doing together things that states cannot or will not do. I talk at the end of my book, and by the way, just for those of you who want to get a sense of the book, the chapter outline of the book is there so you can get a sense of what the whole book will argue, the pieces of the book. But at the end of the book, I talk about a parliament of cities. But that parliament of cities is little more than a formalization of the voluntary global networks that already exist. The World Congress of Meta Networks, called the United Cities and Local Governments, has 3,000 delegates from 100 countries at its 2010 Congress. It's already halfway there. Nobody's ever heard of it, but it's already doing the work of global governance. What is a prospective global civil religion but the common civic expression of how people actually live in cities and what enables migrant workers, whether they're taxi drivers or accountants, to roam from city to city looking for work without ever really leaving town? Cities come in varieties of every kind, but they also resemble one another functionally and architecturally far more than national cultures or countries do. In Barcelona, the city and Cisco Systems just announced a new city protocol based on the Internet Protocol, the IP, which will create a global series of common practices and common protocols that will allow cities to work together, imitate one another, to achieve a progressive framework for performance in environmental sustainability, economic competitiveness, quality of life, city services, and other areas. Cities really are remarkably alike. And it's not just because of the McWorld that I talked about in a book several decades ago. It's because they resemble each other in that they are the neighborhoods where they live. In the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, "All capital cities are alike. Paris and London seem to me," this was 1750, "Paris and London seem to me the same town," he said. And Boswell made the same comment on his continental tour. Are Berlin, Tokyo, New York, or Warsaw really so different from one another today? I travel to all of them frequently, and my answer is no. The cross-border civil society envisioned here, then, is simply the global network of partnerships, associations that already share common civic values, of communities already engaged in the struggle for human rights, of religious associations with an ecumenical outlook, of international societies of artists, and social networks of friends, real and virtual, that spiral out to encompass strangers. Such a network need not be called for. It's not waiting to be born. The network is already half grown, waiting only to be recognized, encouraged, and taken advantage of. Novel mechanisms of cooperation and common decision-making are in fact already allowing cities to address in common concrete issues of weapons, of trade, of climate change, of cultural exchange, of crime, drugs, transportation, public health, immigration, and technology. They need not be formal institutions. A councilman of Chicago traveled a while ago to Seville, Spain, and he saw bike share programs where you have public bikes out that anybody can get on and bike around and put somewhere else. He borrowed it for Chicago. There are now, in 300 major cities, over 1 million bike share programs. In no country is there a law mandating bike share. In no city was there legislation, but through best practices, through imitation, through communication, cities have found that bike share programs work. They take people out of cars, they lower carbon emissions, they increase the health of people. They're a good idea. And cooperation around good ideas and best practices is what cities, again, are already doing. Even in Europe, I think you'll find that network cities are doing far better than the nation states of Europe. And if you ask Wolfgang Schuster, the mayor of Stuttgart, who's responsible for a number of associations, if you ask Mayor Abdanovich, who's here today, of Gdansk, what the Hansa League is doing, if you ask mayors engaged actually in the work, they will tell you this is not a very new idea, it's already happening. But that's an important point, because when I talk about these ideas, the first reaction I get is, you're a utopian, you're idealist, it will never happen, it can't happen. This is not a prescription that I offer, but a description of what is actually happening. And that makes the idea viable and practical, as well as politically important. This call then to let mayors become global governors and enable their citizens to reach across frontiers and become citizens without borders, citoyens sans frontières. We have médecins sans frontières. We have diseases without frontier. We have terrorists without frontiers. We have war without frontiers, technology without frontiers. The one thing we do not have is citoyens sans frontières. And that is what we need. And that's what is beginning to happen. This recipe then asks only that we recognize a world already in the making, one coming into being without systematic planning or the blessing of any state-based authority. It asks that we take advantage of the unique opportunity of cities for cooperation and egalitarianism. It takes advantage of what is in motion now. If mayors are to rule the world, then it is clear to do so, they will have to deal with and pay their due to prime ministers and presidents. Cities may already constitute networks of collaboration that influence the global economy, bypass the rules and regulations of states, but nonetheless, every mayor will tell you cities lie within the jurisdiction and sovereignty and budgets of superior political bodies, which they sometimes manage to bypass or transcend, but which are always there. Mayor Bloomberg boasted that he has his own army, but let him try to deploy that army in Cuba, or in Washington, or even in Albany. He can route bikes through Manhattan, but let him try to do it on the New York Thruway or on the interstate highway system. Governance is about power as well as problem solving, jurisdiction as well as functions, so that the relationship of cities to states is obviously of critical concern. And there are these two crucial questions, which I won't address here, but I will try to address in the larger work. Are the interests of cities and of states to which cities belong in harmony or in conflict? And the answer to that is they are often in tension, if not in conflict. And that's a serious problem. And the second question is, can cities do what they do in the face of governmental opposition from central governments? Governments that are not merely indifferent to what cities do, but hostile, as happens in many cases, to what they do. Certainly it's clear that the interests of cities and of the nations to which they belong are necessarily in tension. Saskia Sassen wrote in her book a while ago that there is a natural tension between cities and larger governments in a globalizing world. Cities more drawn to the globe, states antagonistic to it. States will surely fight to bring globalizing cities back under their control if cities stray too far. and they will demonstrate forcefully that however collaborative cities may regard themselves, they remain creatures of state power and subsidiaries of national sovereignty and central government budgets. Unlike corporations or associations, states are territorial by definition, and cities always sit on territory, on land that is part of some state's territory. New York may not pay much attention to Washington, but Washington will be watching New York, which after all is an American city. While citizens can dream across borders, they are defined by and owe their loyalty not just to the local city alone, nor to some emerging global cosmopolis, but they owe their loyalty to national flags and patriotic anthems and defining national missions. For Mayor Bloomberg and proud New Yorkers, this means they must listen not just to New York. New York is a wonderful town, you know that wonderful tune from the musical, but they also have to listen to America the Beautiful and to the larger nation that claims to be a beacon of liberty to the world. In France, it reminds intellectuals in the 5e arrondissement that la mission civilisatrice is French, not Parisian. And in Germany, it warns that Deutschland über alles is not just a national anthem that signifies a vanished empire or fascist hubris, but it also indicates the sovereignty of Germany over Frankfurt and Munich and Berlin. Texas may sometimes imagine cutting itself off from the United States and floating away and be a nation of its own. And some people in Austin, Texas, a little intellectual enclave in the middle of Texas, imagine themselves cutting themselves off from Texas and floating away. But both Austin and Texas are inevitably American and must obey American law and are part of the American Commonwealth. The success of cities as global governors must then complement the efforts of states and be able to offset sovereign incapacities without pretending that nations don't exist or without making them villains in the story of democratic globalization. Because cities that turn states into villains will win only the opposition and enmity of those states and will make their own progress even harder. The success, then, that we look for will mean that we understand and build upon the successes of lesser known but robust civic entities and networks that are already around. And excuse the names, but I just want to give you a few concrete names so you'll see that there's a palpable reality here. The International Union of Local Authorities, Metropolis, the World Association of Major Metropolises, the American League of Cities, the ICLEI, which is Local Governments for Sustainability, the C40 cities, started after Copenhagen, focused on addressing climate change that the Clinton Foundation helped to create, United Cities and Local Governments, the new Hanseatic League that our mayor from nearby Gdansk has played a crucial role in revitalizing, the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement and the Association of Mayors Against Illegal Guns in the United States, and the Mega Cities Foundation, and as I mentioned at the beginning, City Protocol, a new global network, a web-based network of cities developing best practices for one another. With or without, then, authoritative underwriting, network cities and megacities are likely to determine whether democracy, maybe even civilization itself, will survive in the coming decades when the primary challenge will remain how to overcome the violent conflict within and between states and how to address the disastrous economic and ecological anarchy, the inequalities and injustices that the absence of global democratic governance means will happen. We are already stumbling into that seductive but deadly anarchy in which pandemics and ecological catastrophes are allowed to flourish in sovereignty's name with nations saying, not at the expense of my sovereignty will you monitor air quality in my city. Not in my country will you monitor nuclear weapons. We are a sovereign nation. Not in my country will you regulate petroleum drilling or fracking for natural gas. That's my prerogative for my country. The petroleum industry, the carbon industry is global. Its regulation is in the hands of states. There is an asymmetry. There is no capacity to control ecological events when we do it one state at a time, but that is how we are doing it today. We already live in an era of global private monopolies in money and influence that are empowered under the banner of market liberty, but are anything but free. What is missing is not globalization, but globalization that is public rather than private, democratic rather than hegemonic, egalitarian rather than monopolistic. In struggling against global anarchy and the brute winner-take-all mentality, cities working across borders can make a difference. By working voluntarily and cooperatively to pursue sustainability, justice, and democratic equality, both locally and globally. Cities woven into an informal cosmopolis can become, as the polis once was, the incubators of democracy, this time on a global, not a local scale. Now, of course, it's true that historically, most cities have been subordinated not just to inequality and corruption, but also to the politics of kingship and empire. Nonetheless, their tendencies remain anti-ideological and, in a practical sense, democratic, even in undemocratic times. City politics are persuasive rather than preemptory. Their governors are neighbors of other citizens with responsibility to them rather than remote rulers making decisions in a distant capital. Under siege from imperial marauders in the earlier millennium and the Middle Ages, cities nonetheless had to persist in overseeing the necessities of everyday life. Cities are the habitats for common life. They are where people live and hence where they learn, they love, they work, they sleep, they pray, they play, they grow, they eat, and finally they die. Even with armies at the gates or plagues in the streets, city dwellers occupy themselves with the everyday. Their paramount aims, and thus the aims of mayors they are elect to serve them, are mundane, even parochial. Collecting garbage, perhaps collecting art, rather than collecting votes or collecting allies. Putting up buildings and running buses rather than putting up flags and running political parties. Securing the flow of water rather than the flow of arms. Fostering education and culture, not fostering national defense and patriotism. Promoting collaboration, not exceptionalism. Encouraging a knowing sense of participation and pride in community rather than institutionalizing blind patriotism. Cities have little choice. To survive and flourish, they must remain hospitable to pragmatism, to problem solving, to networking, to creativity, to innovation, and to cooperation. Come hell or high water, come war or siege, they have to worry about plowing the streets when it snows, providing parking places, and yes, always and everywhere, picking up the garbage. Their defining association with trade, with business, with transportation, with communication, with today digital technology, and with culture, in other words, with creativity and imagination, is a natural feature of human proximity and of population density. As Richard Florida has written, the real key to unleashing our creativity lies in humanity's greatest invention. That is, says Richard Florida, the city. Cities, he says, are veritable magnetrons for creativity. He's right. Creativity and imagination drive invention, commerce, and culture. In addition to that, they are engines of democracy. And what the arts, city, and democracy have in common is the need of the creative imagination to see in others people like you across the lines of race and religion. To consider then the future of the city as a foundation for democratic global governance also means looking to the city's past and its ancient democratic origins. We live in an era where the great circle seems to be completing itself, where the city that appeared at the beginning of civilization as an incubator of democracy, as our first human habitat, has once again become the habitat that may allow us to govern the world together. As men and women produced language, culture, and economy, they gathered into communities in the ancient world. Edward Glaser speaks of humankind as, quote, an urban species whose cities are made of flesh, not concrete. The Greeks gave the name polis to these early communities, and in the case of Athens, they were really little more than a politicized collection of tribes. The trouble is, as we know, following the ancient world, cities were too small to be the operating political units for growing populations in expanded territories. But the polis was born to grow, and grow it did from polis to town, from town to fortified market, from rural market center to expansive trading crossroads, increasingly outgrowing the walls that protected it against invaders as it reached out to an ever larger world, connected by highways and rivers, trading routes, and navigable seas. We once thought of the city as the place of walls. The English word town comes from the German word Zaun, the fence, the wall, which you first see in a city. But the reality is cities quickly outgrew their walls, and today it is bridges, crossroads that define the city and not walls. Almost 90% of the urban population of the world live on oceans and seas. A warning, by the way, for global warming, because the rising seas will particularly threaten people in cities, but also a tribute to their interest in commerce, transportation, trade, exchange, cultural mixing, multiculturalism. The history of the city helps explain why the city has the characteristics it does today that make it diverse, multicultural, communicative, cooperative in ways that nation states are not. Yet despite the surging history of urbanization, despite the fact that today half the world lives in cities, just a half century ago, in 1958, Edward Banfield, the great sociologist, wrote with confidence, and I quote, "Most of the people of the world live and die without ever achieving membership in a community larger than the family or a tribe. Outside of Europe and America, the concerting of behavior in political associations and corporate organizations is a rare and recent thing." In other words, 50 years ago, an eminent sociologist could say the world is still essentially a rural, an ex-urban, a country place, and that cities are the exception. Yet in the half century since that time, capital cities has been morphing into networked megacities of tens of millions, intersecting with other cities to comprise today's burgeoning megalopolises, mega regions in which an increasing majority of the Earth's population live. Tribes still dominate in certain cultures, but even in Africa, megacity conurbations have emerged representing territorially immense urban juggernauts that encompass populations of 10, 20, and 30 million people. Look at Lagos, Ibadan, Cotonou region near Lagos in Nigeria, which will reach 25 million people within the next 10 years, making it the world's third largest city, after Mumbai and Tokyo. Look at Kinshasa, Brazzaville, two interconnected cities in two different countries that make up one megacity. Look at China, where in the last 15 years, 100 new cities, over 1 million people, have in effect been invented from almost nothing. And where McKinsey estimates in the next 15 years, 100 of the top 600 measured by GDP size, gross domestic product size, 100 of those 600 cities will be Chinese cities, almost all of them new. Such is the radical transformation that urbanization is now making in the world we live in today. So we live in a world of megacities. They are there, and the question is, can we transform them? Can we encourage them? Can we move them along towards something replicating global governance? Clearly, the city is a formidable and potentially mind-expanding alternative to the nation-state paradigm in which our thinking has been locked up for so long. The very term international assumes that nation-states must be the starting place for interrelational thinking. And in political science departments across the world, we talk about international relations. Not inter-NGO relations, inter-agent, inter-citizen, inter-civic movement, or inter-city relations, but international relations. The assumption is only nations can connect, whereas it turns out that nations are the last to connect effectively and the first to make war on one another. So God knows there is an extraordinary need for a transformation of our paradigm. The earth itself pleads the cause of cities. The seas are rising, the glaciers are melting, the atmosphere warming. I've already said that with the number of people who live in cities on the coast of seas and oceans, they are particularly threatened. Yet the 193 nations that gathered in Copenhagen and then recently in Mexico City and Durban and soon Rio remain implacable and unmovable. There has been zero progress towards effective control of carbon emissions through the efforts of nation states, who have been too busy explaining why their sovereignty and their pursuit of independence prevents them from taking any action together. Little island nations like the Maldives are likely to vanish in the next 15 or 20 or 30 years, and the economies of the very nations that refuse to take action are likely to be devastated. But the nation state seems intent on going down in complacent oblivion with its antique but ever-prized sovereignty intact. Listen to the Democratic and the Republican conventions, but Democrats too, supporters of Obama, not just supporters of Romney, shout at their convention, USA, 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 embracing a dying behemoth without the will or capacity to safeguard them from the interdependent world that is at their doorstep. But still, we think only in those terms, and that's true in other countries as well. Polish nationalism, German nationalism, Italian nationalism, Spanish nationalism, Chinese nationalism for sure, remain more potent than the sense of the perils of an interdependent world. And the two most powerful nations on earth, China and the United States, seem the two least likely to be able to cooperate across borders. It's the same thing with poverty as with the environment. Rich nations find ways to grow richer and poor nations grow poorer, but it's sovereignty that fuels greed and continues the dismaying inequalities between North and South. The problem is political, not economic. The 99% watch the 1% dominate the global economy, but they do so inside nation states, where even if they vote for a progressive redistributionist government, little can really be done, while the bottom half sink into abject poverty around the world. And it's no different with the global recession. Mortgage holders default, businesses go under, secondary markets collapse, banks fail, but the causes are more closely associated with democratic than with fiscal defects. Above all, the absence of global civic trust, transnational civic capital, a trans-border capacity to deal with trans-border deficits. For decades, thinkers like Masao Miyosha have been announcing the coming of a borderless world. That's his term from 35, 40 years ago. And I've been talking about interdependence, and Clinton and Obama and Pope John Paul II have all been talking about interdependence for a long time, interdependence as our reality. But while our social and cultural and civic and economic and technological reality is interdependence, our political reality remains defined by independence, autonomous, sovereign, independent states. So as futurists and pessimists alike pontificate, as I do, about a world without borders, defined by inventive technologies, unremitting terrorism, liberated markets, uncontrollable labor migration, asymmetrical war, novel diseases, weapons of mass destruction, still the same complacent sovereigntists, the so-called new nationalists, the conservative patriots, rattle on about the sanctity of frontiers and the autonomy of nation states, and they too shout, USA, USA. In a way, they're unwitting idealists. They call themselves realists, but they're really the idealists. They hold up the ideal of a disappeared world of nation states, while the brute reality is the reality of an interdependence they do not recognize. Thus, they don't notice that the traditional democratic politics they embrace is caught up in the old box of sovereignty and has become irrelevant to the new transnational realities like banks and multinational corporations. Tethered to independence and the social contract theory 400 years ago that gave birth to independent states, democracy is under pressure, under duress, challenged once again by the problem of scale. As scale undermined the polis and gave birth to the nation state, today global scale threatens the nation state and seeks a new solution. It's clear to me that cities can and will be able to govern globally, and it's clear to me that states have not, cannot, and will not. For cities to govern globally, they don't need to write a global charter of cities like the Charter of the United Nations. They don't have to promulgate a new Declaration of City Rights. We already understand rights, and we've codified them in the modern world from sun up to sundown. We already understand what it takes to enforce rights. What we lack today is global democratic mechanisms by which rights can be enacted and enforced on a global level where they are needed. To talk about rights within states when the challenges to rights are global, planetary, and interdependent simply can't work. We know, too, that it's not a matter of writing a global city constitution. Rights are, as Madison said, just paper, parchment barriers. They don't really help us against abuse. Only when you have institutions and citizens who can enforce and protect and understand rights do rights have any meaning, and that's what is missing today. And of course, while states refuse cooperation, it's cities that will bear the consequences. To take a poignant example, if terrorists manage to detonate a dirty bomb or a nuclear device sometime in the next years, it may be states like the Great Satan United States, as it's called, by them that will be threatened by their rhetoric, but it will be cities like Los Angeles and New York that will suffer the carnage. Cities cannot wait for states to figure out the meaning of interdependence. As David Wiley observed, to redress the disconnect, cities and towns will have to begin to elect representatives to make common cause with one another. There's little chance that we can jump ahead and constitute a formal world government that, like the nation state, is unitary and authoritative and top-down, and somehow still remain democratic. But that's not necessary. Piecemeal is what we need. Piecemeal reform, piecemeal change. And that describes what's taking place. Informal governance achieved is better than formal governance unrealized. A parliament of cities that deliberates and undertakes to do whatever cities are willing voluntarily to do is a better bet than a unitary world government handing down decisions that nobody pays attention to. A global league of cities is not the same thing as a global central government, but this is probably a virtue because it means a parliament of cities will be able to act locally and globally, through persuasion, through example, through best practices, rather than to give orders that nobody obeys. Moreover, as we've seen, city networks are already involved in webs of influence and interactivity. They are already doing work together. Full circle then, can cities save the world? That's probably too daunting a challenge, but it seems possible they can rescue democracy from sovereignty and help find ways to govern the world democratically and bottom up, if only informally. The first step may be to convene a meeting of a few courageous mayors to consider what it may take to convene a global parliament of mayors. This step is more than a dream. Mayor Bloomberg of New York has already embraced the idea. Mayor Schuster of Stuttgart has asked to be part. Last week I spoke to Mayor Park of Seoul, Korea, and he invited me and a group of mayors to come to Seoul to talk about convening such a thing. So this is not an academic pipe dream, but it is the start of something already real. Cities governing globally is not a dream, but a pragmatic project already in the making. It's not an ideal to be realized, but a reality to be implemented. It is happening. Anyone who cares about democracy, about justice, about peace in this anarchic, unjust, and violent global world should be supporting it. It is time to change the subject. Let's stop talking about independent states and sturdy sovereignty. Let's start talking about interdependent cities and the small, shared, fragile planet on which we all live together. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have 15 minutes for Q&A session, so please.
There's a microphone in the middle?
Yes, there is a microphone in the middle. Please, go ahead.
Cristiano Pinzauti, Italian entrepreneur in Poland, Vice President of PKP Leviathan. In order not to be misunderstood in my question, let me say immediately that I do recognize, obviously, the high value of what can be done at the level of cities, both locally, which is obvious, but also cross-border in international cooperations. The problem which seems to be manifest, and in particular it is very important in my country, which is also the country of our ancestors, is the different level of GNP per capita among the cities of the same state. So that some way certain golden rules should be applied in order to distribute what is generally found at the general level, at the state level, into the different regions and in particular in the different cities. There are many different solutions, of course, and I'd like you to elaborate on that because obviously the purpose is to give at the same time the local electorate of the mayors the feeling that their money, the money that they produce, the GNP that they produce, is used appropriately by the local authorities, and at the same time that a certain redistribution of GNP towards the less favored parts of the country is operated so that long-term such a difference will not be. And of course it's a very difficult thing to realize, but since you've been thinking a lot about this, I'm very interested to know if there is any such gold rule or what are the tendencies, how people are solving the problem.
Thank you very much, and it's a very important question and a good question, and I can only deal with it partially from the perspective of cities alone, because as you said in posing the question quite correctly, this is a problem that involves regions and states, not just cities, and you can't expect, for example, Warsaw to redistribute some of its income to a city in India and that will solve the problem. So you're quite right to say that's the problem. But let me say two things about it. One, in the outline up there, there are two chapters, one on inequality and the problems of inequality within and among cities. One is called Planet of Slums, based on Mike Davis has a wonderful book about global cities. He's much less enthusiastic than I am, and he starts with the title, Planet of Slums. His planet of cities is a planet of slums, where you have, particularly in the new megacities of the third world, you have extraordinary poverty and extraordinary segregation and extraordinary inequality, which is, of course, what your question points to. And then there is also a great deal of inequality, even within cities, never mind regions. Both of those are problems. I say in my book, is my call to globalize cities a call to globalize slums? Because it could be taken as that. If you assume that cities are all about slums, let's globalize them, so let's globalize urban inequality, let's globalize urban segregation. Obviously, that's not what I want to do. So it raises two questions. I'll answer half of the question, the other I can't do. The half I will answer is that I think there are solutions within cities to deal with urban poverty and segregation that are more effective locally than through national governments. And that's because cities by nature are creative, cities are mobile, and cities attract people who are looking to change their lives. And historically, cities have done better with poverty, bad as they've done better with poverty than regions and nations have done. In chapter 7, which is up there, Mitigating Inequality, I talk about a number of approaches to urban inequality that include desegregation, include formalizing the informal economy, include microfinance, include ways of dealing with poverty within cities that cities are already doing, not new ideas, that suggest that inequality within cities is a difficult problem, but not an insuperable problem, and not a reason to not use cities as a platform for global governance. But the larger question you raise is spot on, I completely agree with you, and speaks to the problem I addressed at the beginning, which is that without some cooperation from states, state budgets, state finances, without some inter-regional and international actions, north-south transfers, and so on, it will be very hard for cities to solve the global problems of justice and inequality. So yes, that's why I said you're not going to replace states with cities. They will complement what states do, and we will have to continue to find solutions with states. But they can become sponsors of state efforts. Cities are a majority of the world's people, and in democracies at least, that means increasingly they'll be able to control the states. One thing that is happening in the United States today is that the battle between Romney and Obama is a battle between the country and the city, between the red states, the Republican states, which are rural, white, southern, southwestern, and the big urban states that are multicultural and diverse and more progressive. And that battle will be a little bit replicated in the world, but as cities become more dominant and more populated, cities will be in a better position to control national politics and perhaps be able to solve some problems. But the last thing, let me say, is that with or without a resolution of those problems, we need some form of national governance, global governance, to regulate everything from terrorism, weapons trade, pandemics, and global warming. And progress we make on that score, even in the face of continuing inequality, will be important. We can't solve all problems at once, and I don't want to pretend that a governance of cities will solve every problem, and for the reasons you stated. The inequality, the injustice problem cannot be solved, certainly by cities alone. But a lot of other things can be addressed and can be improved, and I see no reason not to progress over here, even if we can't do it here. We have not learned how to cure cancer. but there's been a lot of progress, and we ought to continue that progress even though we don't have a cure for cancer. Global inequality, because of the inequality between North and South, developed and underdeveloped nations, is a fundamental problem, and it puts in peril everything, including this. But I nonetheless would argue we need to pursue this even as we're trying to find ways to deal with the problems of inequality that by itself cities cannot do. That's it.
Some other questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Jakub Wojnarowski, Leviathan. I would like to go further with the Cristiano question.
Yes.
What, in your opinion, should be the role of the cities towards the regions? Because there is, something in between Tokyo and Paris and Berlin and Washington. There are some small towns and villages and regions, and people are living there. So, and you said that cities would not exchange countries or nations, but what should be their role toward that problem?
Well, that's again a very important question. Some people, again, does the government, the global governance of cities mean government of slums and inequality? Well, we have to address that question. The other question is, if half the world's population live in cities, the other half doesn't. And if you have global governance of cities, what about the people who don't live in cities? Aren't you, in effect, empowering one half the world against the other half of the world? And is that really a good idea? So that's a part of that question of the relationship of cities to their surrounding territory. And again, I have not a simple answer. There's no simple answer to that. Part of the answer is always as compared to what. I would rather have global governance of cities than no global governance at all, even though it's unrepresentative. That's one answer. But a second more important answer is already in the global world we live in, cities have a intimate relationship with the regions, the countryside, and the farms around them. We know that local agriculture has in many cities become extremely important, and people are looking for ways to satisfy their agricultural and food needs from the local agriculture, which means farmers living within 100 miles or 200 kilometers of a city will have a relationship to the city even though they don't live in the city. So there are ways in which areas that are not urban are becoming attached to the urban. There may be ways, therefore, to represent those farmers and those people in global governance. They will, in any case, be implicated in the interests of the cities because local farmers need cities to sell their goods. So what we need to look for is nuanced forms of networks between the city and the surrounding regions. That happened even back in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, people who lived in the countryside went into the walled cities when marauders and plunderers were in the neighborhood to be protected. So they had a relationship to cities in their vicinity. But again, that's an extremely important question. The last thing I'd say is there is nothing to prevent rural regions from creating a rural global parliament of regions. Let them do that, and then we have a parliament of cities, and we have a bicameral legislature, a parliament of cities, a parliament of regions. That's okay. This is because we're talking about voluntary. We're not talking about somebody ruling somebody else. The parliament of cities, I'm suggesting, doesn't make law for the world. It creates best practices, it shows examples, and it says to those cities and regions that want to, copy us, do what we do, it will be a better world. So in that sense, it's not a question of legislation without representation, because this global parliament will not be legislating. And therefore, the question of representation is a little different than when people are making laws for others who are not represented. But it's still a question that needs to be addressed, and it is chapter 12 in the book does address. So inequality and representation are both absolutely crucial questions. They both affect democracy. I said cities can save democracy, but inequality and representation are two features of democracy, which, as your questions suggest, aren't fully responded to by the governance of cities. But again, this is a partial solution. I always, as a political scientist, I always ask, as compared to what? You know the old joke, how's your wife? As compared to what? How's the global governance of cities? As compared to what? As compared to perfect democracy, terrible. But as compared to the anarchy in which global banks, global corporations, and terrorists run the world, it's very good. So in that feature, as a political solution, political solutions are always imperfect and pragmatic and not very ideal. But to me, again, that's why I say part of what I want to do is change the subject. Because even that we talk about this, your question, which is so, but what about inequality? But it becomes a different question in the context of cities. We've been talking for 50 or 100 years about North-South and colonial world and developed world and the relationship between poor nations and rich nations. When you talk about cities, it changes a little bit how we think about inequality. It doesn't solve the problem, but it changes how we think about it. Same with representation. It changes how we think about the problem. So this is genuinely a kind of paradigm shift in which we change how we think about the problems we face, whether they're ecological problems or terrorism or anything else. And let me be just very practical on that score. Let's talk about terrorism. You might say, well, what can cities do about terrorism? In 2001, after 9/11 in New York, after September 11th, Mayor Giuliani, who was then the mayor, sent 12 New York City detectives to Washington, to the new Homeland Security Department, to gather information about global terrorism, to work with the FBI and the National Security Agency and so on. And they stayed about 18 months and they came home, and by the time they came home, Bloomberg was mayor and Ray Kelly was the police commissioner. They came home in 18 months and they said to Mayor Bloomberg, this is pointless. We've been there for 18 months. We've learned nothing. There's no intelligence in Washington. The FBI doesn't talk to the CIA. The CIA doesn't talk to Interpol. We're getting no info. This is useless. Ray Kelly then said to those 12 detectives, okay, you go to Singapore, you go to Shanghai, you go to Frankfurt, you go to Rio. He dispatched them to 12 global capitals that were listing points for global intelligence. One of the reasons I believe, and Ray Kelly, the police commissioner, believes that New York has been safe since then from a terrorist attack, is that New York's anti-terrorist intelligence gathering squad is not in Washington, but it's global. It's city to city. They're cooperating directly with the anti-terrorist squads in other cities. They're dealing with the terrorist problem as an intercity problem, not as a national intelligence question. And that's a very practical example of what happens when you change how you think. And you don't assume that intelligence is a national function to be done by national intelligence agencies cooperating with each other, which they don't. And we've all seen the movies where national intelligence agencies won't cooperate with one another. But cities will, city policemen will. They have the same problem. The guys in Singapore and the guys in London, the guys in Frankfurt also worry about dirty bombs. They have a very good motive for sharing intelligence, where in Washington and the capitals elsewhere, the concern is with national security questions. How much can we let the other intelligence agency know? What are we going to do bureaucratically? So changing the subject, changing the focus really does change how you think about things. Same with carbon emissions. Let me mention that 80% or 85% of carbon emissions are generated in cities. That means if cities can control carbon emissions inside cities, we can do a lot. The United States and China control 40% of carbon emissions. Cities control 80% of carbon emissions. So much better than an agreement between China and the United States, which seems rather unlikely, is an agreement among cities, which the C40 and other city-based global networks are doing. That's a much better way to achieve progress. And indeed, there's been a good deal of progress through cities, which isn't registered when people say Copenhagen's a failure, Durban's a failure, Rio's a failure, we're making no progress, we're going backwards from Kyoto, not forward. Well, that's not true when you look at what cities are doing. So this is a real and practical way. It's not ideal, but it's the best of all possible worlds in Voltaire's old sense, and that's not bad.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. The book should be done next year, and there will be a Polish edition.
Okay. Benjamin Barber, thank you very much. Thank you.